Assalamu alaikum. Happy International Muslim History Month. Do you guys know that May is International Muslim History Month? We've been joining you every Friday. This is the third Friday, and I'm super excited to be chatting with you guys today. Our founder of World Hijab Day organization, Nazma Khan, also founded International Muslim History Month in 2021. So the goal of International Muslim History Month is to have the world come together and learn more and celebrate the accomplishments of Muslim men and women from past and present. So they've shaped humanity, and we want people to know what they've done. So I have a speaker here with me. I'm really excited to introduce her. Miss Eshmawy is a PhD ABD and an adjunct professor at Fordham University. She's an urban designer, planner, and let me see if I can get this word out. It's early for me, you guys. Infrastructure economist focusing on US and MENA region national policy. Emie has rotations at various federal agencies, including the Library of Congress, State Department, and HUD while in DC. Ms. Eshmawy assisted in rulemaking regarding the mortgage crisis of 2008. She also holds a master's of urban planning from New York University, a master of arts from the American University in Cairo. She has a BA in political science, history, and global studies from the University of Minnesota. And her research focuses on infrastructure economics and urban design in the Arab states. So I'm very excited to introduce to you Dr. Emie Eshmawy. Let me bring her up here. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks so much for having me, and very, very excited to be a part of this initiative. It's a good way to start your Friday morning.
It really is. I'm always so glad that it's Friday. It's such a lovely day, and to be able to sit down and talk with you is great. I hope that we all learn something new.
Hopefully.
Yes. I'm really excited that you're joining me. Thank you so much. And I loved doing your introduction. You're so accomplished, mashallah. Reading your degrees and what you do, it sounds very interesting, and it sounds like a lot of fun. So I'm really excited. Who will you be talking about today?
So we're actually going to be talking about Abbas ibn Firnas, who was a huge change maker in the 9th century. And, for those that are watching that are interested in flight and, physics and anything related to modern day, flying, he's basically the father of it. So when we talk about being the father of it, we think of the Wright brothers and we think of, Amelia Earhart and where did her plane go? But no, the actual person that initially had attempted to fly was Abbas ibn Firnas. He started, having kind of a general interest in, as we know, Cordoba today. So he was born to Berber parents in modern day Spain, and the Latinized version of his name is Armin Furman. So he was an Andalusian. So we're talking about Moorish Spain in the 9th century, and various accomplishments coming out of that era. As we know it today, algebra, al-Gabr, was came out of that era as well. So he had, first he was Muslim, and so it was already difficult to live in southern Spain amongst Catholics. As you know, 6 centuries later, the Muslims were, kicked out of Spain under Queen Isabella. And so there was a constant revitalization period with Moors in Spain. And so Abbas ibn Firnas took a liking to inventions. So we can kind of think of him as an old school Tesla, but it's important to think about him in a liberal arts sense, because the philosophies of invention and not being afraid to try something new and, fighting against what all of society tells you essentially that you can't do, is really connected to this gentleman.
That's very cool. I remember I read a little bit about him and the wings that he kind of made. It's so interesting, and I think a lot of people are interested in flight because flying is how we see our friends and our family because everybody ends up kind of spread out sometimes. So you mentioned where he was from. Is there anything else that you want to highlight that he did?
Yeah, definitely. So I can go on and on about him because he's my favorite historical figure. So my undergrad is in history, global studies and political science. And I was not planning for that path at all. I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to design things. I'm very handy. I like drawing. I like building things. And, for whatever reason, I ended up in that path. And I think that's how I discovered my own culture. So I grew up in Minnesota, in a suburban town called Bloomington. For anybody that's watching that might be a sports fanatic, which I am a sports fanatic, the Met Center, was in the city of Bloomington. It was knocked down for the Mall of America to be built. So I grew up in this town that was almost entirely Scandinavian, or, not very well, not very diverse. And this is in the mid 90s, end of the 90s. And I was always trying to figure out, how am I going to fit in? How am I going to fit in? How am I going to fit in? Immigrant daughter of Egyptian parents. And, just kind of trying to find my way, basically, and figure out my identity. And I remember beginning to follow my father's interests. My father's an aeronautical engineer. And, just trying to understand, well, why? Why did he choose that path? How did it happen? And realizing the way that he chose his path was completely different than the way that I would choose my path. And it would be far more difficult because of the way that the college system in America is set up. When I entered college, I basically ended up switching majors. I started out pre-med and I dropped out due to a array of reasons. And primarily because I wish I would have just gone into architecture and design or engineering, civil engineering. So I had, come across this individual attempting to reconcile how I grew up, my father's background, who's, my parents are my best friends, and, trying to make sense of it for me to be able to understand my own identity and what I was going through. And I think I came to the conclusion that trying to tie my history to what my interests were was going to salvage my identity, ultimately. And what I ended up doing was learning about him and kind of went from there. What intrigued me about him the most, about Abbas ibn Firnas, was that he kind of, you had so much scientific and mathematical and even liberal thought processes going through Spain at that time. And what was most poignant about him was that he didn't give up. So his identity as a Muslim, which was common at that time, we look back on it now and nobody would know that he was the first person to attempt flight if it's not mentioned historically. So knowing that he is somebody to refer back to, knowing that this is a man who basically put feathers on his arms with extremely long boards in an attempt to jump off of a hill and just prove that he could go even one extra inch similar to a bird is what made him interesting. And the reality is that while everybody laughed, I'm sure he looked very silly, I'm sure there was an aesthetic portion of this. He flew, and he flew a few meters, and it was recorded. And that's when we start to learn about the four different types of flight, the four different theories of flight, right? So, concepts of like lift and mass and, different physics elements. That's where we, that we refer back to him in that Renaissance period for Muslims, right? The important part of that, what's more interesting, is that it's only 100 or 150 years after the advent of Islam. So you're in a golden age that's very far away. I mean, Spain is not near Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi as we know it today in Yemen. It's very, very far away. So for knowing that something like that could spread in 100 years, and then we have all these great accomplishments coming out of it, liberal thoughts, physics thoughts, engineering thoughts. It's really amazing to look at the history and understand that you have an individual you can refer back to and say, this is the first point that we know that's recorded in the history of mankind, and knowing that this man knew he was going to fail. He knew he was never going to get to actually fly like a bird because engines and electricity had not been invented yet. But he didn't stop, and he persevered, and he kept trying. So, we need to take that nowadays as a concept of change makers, because had he not initially tried to do that, we would not have any concepts that we could even fly. And now you think about everything from commerce to, vacations, to travel, to visiting. And we actually can go back in history and actively say that one of the very first change makers related to flight was a Muslim man in Moorish Spain. Not in the Arab world, but in the European world. So that's, I think, why I had thought it would be such a good idea to talk about him and kind of connect him back and relate him back to, what's happening today, with various, Muslims in the world making changes, and even from a liberal arts sense, right? Like books and writing and elements that have come out. We also have, there's multiple Nobel Peace Prize winners that have come out of the Middle East. And, it's not that they're, not that they're not as famous, say, as somebody else that's getting the Nobel Peace Prize, but they're just, they're not as, their name is not as famous. And there's, multiple reasons for that, again, tied into the history of how we are as a community and how our narrative is.
Right. When I think about, I'm picturing in my mind someone putting feathers and creating these wings on their arms. I go back to like movies, for example, where kids in movies are, trying to kind of do the same thing essentially. Somebody's like trying to jump off their roof or something like that, and everybody's like, oh no, you can't do that, or they think it's so silly. But that's kind of what started flight in the first place, and
Right.
we laugh because kids tried to do it, but look where it led. But so that's very interesting.
Absolutely. And I want to add one more thing to that before we go on. And I had mentioned it before we had started speaking. There was a book in college that had impacted me to try to figure out how I can try to make an impact in the community. I mean, I'm in public service. I work for HUD, so the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. But, I made a conscious decision to join federal service, although, could have probably done whatever, just like anybody else. But it was one book that really impacted me in college. And I took it in a political science class with, I believe the professor's name was Martin Simpson at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, my undergrad. It's called Perceptions on Palestine by an author named Kathleen Christensen. And Kathleen Christensen writes that the West, and in particular the United States, didn't have really a history of Muslims in America in the 1800s. So when we were, going through parochial school systems being designed, the Spanish-American War, the Constitution being built, the Emancipation Proclamation coming through, all of these things that have built American history, right? Even suffrage, like women's rights in the early 1900s. Through this entire period of time, you don't really hear about a history of Muslims or Middle Easterners or Arabs in America. I mean, you hear about Asian populations coming to the United States. You hear about very, very small Syrian and Lebanese population coming to the tip of Manhattan. And what we know today as Wall Street is where there was actually a large contingency of Lebanese and Syrian individuals who were then, through a process of eminent domain, moved into Brooklyn, into Atlantic Ave. But there's a reason. If you watch the movie Titanic, you watch it very closely. And this is, this follows the line of the book that I'm explaining. If you watch the movie Titanic, silly, observation that I noticed was that there was one person on the entire boat who had something called a tarbouch. And tarbouch is a Turkish hat, basically, that's red and it has a tassel on it. There's only one individual on the third class passengers, and that's in the early 1900s, right? So the producer and the director was obviously trying to make a point that there's all these immigrants coming over on the Titanic to the United States, but that there's this one individual of this specific descent coming over as well. And you ask yourself, why was it just one individual? And then you refer back to the book of Kathleen Christensen. Kathleen Christensen writes that in the early 1800s, when the United States was being built, there was no history of Muslims, Arabs, Middle Easterners in the United States because the Ottoman Empire was economically stronger than the United States at the time. And therefore, on economic grounds alone, there would have been no absolute reason for anybody from the Middle East, North Africa, or the Arab world to have to come to the United States, or anybody that was within the Ottoman Empire. So, and it makes perfect sense. So when we're talking about an American Judeo-Christian history, you're not going to see a lot of Arabs or Muslims because at the time, the Ottoman Empire was far more economically advanced. Only at the beginning of the 1900s, during World War I, is when you start to see Arabs and Muslims come in large numbers. And that's because the Ottoman Empire collapsed. But the history of America as a country, as a nation, had already been written at that point. So now let's tie that back into Abbas ibn Firnas. When we have this juxtaposition of a country that's being built and ideals that are already created, rightfully so, any nation has that right. And you have this new population coming in that nobody knows anything about. We as a community are constantly trying to, prove our worth, prove ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. But if we look back at our history, we look at Abbas ibn Firnas, we look at algebra, or al-Gabr, as his name is in Arabic, and we look at Ibn Khaldun, and all these great, incredible theorists, philosophers, mathematicians, physicists, engineers in our own history, our own Islamic history, we realize that, wait a minute, there's also something to be added to this narrative of being an American Muslim, of being in the United States, of, working with the communities that we live in. And it doesn't have to be that we weren't in the initial thread of the making of the United States on economic gains alone or economic purposes alone. We can look back historically and see, wait a minute, we've got the guy who invented flight, one of the largest economic systems in the United States. We have the guy who invented algebra, which is a high school course now in multiple levels, algebra 1, algebra 2, et cetera, et cetera. And we can look at Ibn Khaldun in understanding the father of sociology. So, and I know about Ibn Khaldun as well because my first master's is in Soc. So, we really have to dig deep and be able to point and say, this is why there's not a lot of information on us in the United States. But did you know that we invented A, B, and C? And I want you all to keep that in mind as a core reason when making your argument as to diversity and belonging and how we can add to the fabric of the West as well. So those conversations and those discussions are very, very important.
Yes, you made some really good points. I think it's really interesting too that you brought up the movie Titanic. I don't know if I would have thought about that. You're not really paying attention to necessarily where everybody's coming from, or you know where they're going to. You know where the Titanic's going, but you don't think about where everybody was coming
from.
Exactly.
And I mean, you have to understand. You really have to understand. And I think this is why the theme for me speaking under liberal arts fits perfectly, because we're talking about the impact of history in feeding into the fabric and feeding into another culture that's not commonly American. That's not to say that there's not a large population of Muslims in the United States, but the underlying way that the United States was created was obviously not built on Muslim or Arab or Middle Easterners, right? It was built on Western Europeans. So I think it's important to bring up and to understand why. The more knowledge you have on your own history, the more you can make an argument as to why something doesn't appear the way that it should, right? And once we can make those intellectual and diplomatic arguments from a historical perspective, just use your history to be able to understand why people don't understand you.
Is there anyone in the present time that you think is also contributing to the same area, same field that maybe people have heard of or have not heard of?
You mean to the same field of
Just, I guess, liberal art.
innovations and
Yeah, innovations. Yeah.
there's so many people that have come out, especially after the Arab Spring. I wouldn't even know where to start, but I would say this. I would say, there's, of course, we have, nonprofit organizations from, the Council on American Islamic Relations. We have, great leaders in that instance. And then we also have great leaders coming out of the East Coast, and sheikhs and imams that are coming out of masjids, people that are donating, to various causes. I don't think in my mind that our community is based on one individual that would, that it would make sense to say this person's doing great things, because I think that there's almost an agglomeration of various individuals that are adding to the fabric, which makes sense, because you're not going to have a tapestry with just one thick thread. You're going to have a tapestry of hundreds of thousands of threads, right? So I wouldn't say there's one, right? There's also not just one inventor anymore or one theorist anymore. I think the reason for that is because of the advancement of technology. We can get anything online. We can get anything through a phone call, a text message. Information spreads like wildfire. I would say, though, that to be able to look at change makers, you absolutely have to make sure there's a product, not of the time, but they have to produce something, or they have to provide a service, whether it's help with homeless, issues, or help with refugees, whatever the issue is, that is sustainable. So you commonly see, and it doesn't matter what country it's in, you'll see a political party come in, you'll see an election come through, and you'll see, someone's elected and they hire somebody from a specific diverse group, and they add to the public service argument, or, discourse or whatnot. But then it doesn't remain sustainable after that electee is not in office anymore. And so we need to be able to utilize the knowledge we have in our community to ensure utility that's long-term. So just because someone's no longer in office doesn't mean that knowledge should go away. And I feel that we see that often, not just in the Muslim community, but other communities as well, minority communities in general. So to pinpoint one person, in my mind, I think, okay, I could pinpoint this person, but that only worked for 4 years. That only worked for 6 years. That only worked for 5 years. Whereas you look at these historical figures, such as Abbas ibn Firnas, such as Ibn Khaldun, who almost 1,500 years ago, 1,400 years ago, and we're still talking about them. We're still talking about them. The same theory applies to everyone from Tesla to Einstein. So there's not going to be one individual impactor in the community, because there shouldn't be nowadays. There should be an agglomeration of individuals that are adding into the tapestry.
I agree. It definitely, in a sense, takes a village. You got to have more than one mind. It wasn't just one person who created the concept of flight, but it was a Muslim man who was like, "Hey, I have this idea," and then it just kind of snowballed.
Absolutely, and it went from there. Yeah. And I wish we were talking about, I wish this was 1902, but it's not. We're talking about 807, early 800s, early 9th century. I mean, there's others too historically that should be discussed. And there's also a crossover of cultures that nobody thinks about historically. I'll give you another figure. Jawhar al-Sayqali, which is Jawhar the Sicilian. Sicily, and at one point in time, was entirely Muslim. Now, I want everybody that's watching to go on Google Maps, and I want you to go look up where Sicily is, and then I want you to look up where Malta is, and then I want you to look up where the shores of Libya and Egypt are, and just kind of map it out and look at the kilometer difference. You're going to be shocked. It's so close, right? And just a quick historical fact. Remember that Italy conquered Libya, and England and France conquered Egypt, which, England and France are extremely far away from both, countries. Now, let's go backwards. Jawhar al-Sayqali, he actually came into Egypt, I want to say and forgive me, I don't know the exact dates, 9th, 10th century. The capital of Egypt is Cairo, as we know it. But in Arabic, it's Al-Qahira. Al-Qahira means the victorious. So why would it be given that name? Before it was Al-Qahira, it was a city called Fustad. Fustad was the old name that was given during another era that was post-Pharaonic in Cairo. What's the point of my story? Jawhar al-Sayqali was a Sicilian general that was commissioned to design and urban plan Cairo as we know it today. And he gave it the name Al-Qahira because it was victorious and it was victoriously planned and victoriously, taken over. There wasn't an Egyptian that designed the city as we know it today. For those of you that are watching that have been to Egypt or are Egyptian, you know how little the streets are in the central part of Cairo. That was put together through 3 or 4 different conquerors, essentially, imperialists. But it was designed by Jawhar al-Sayqali. There's a very famous map. I wish I had submitted it to you beforehand to be able to put, online. But the point that I'm trying to make is it's not just from, it's not just Muslims that are from what we traditionally know as, North Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Western China. Those are not the only people that have had an impact. And that speaks back to the point that we were talking about before, that just because you don't see it in front of you doesn't mean it's not of validity. It doesn't mean that it's not important. Perfect example of that is to give all of these Southern European, not North African philosophers and theorists and show their impact in North Africa. So, it goes both ways. Sharing ideas, knowledge, and innovation absolutely goes both ways. It's not just one theorist or one philosopher. So
I love that you are talking about Muslims who are kind of outside the Middle East. It's sometimes because so many people just associate Muslims with the Middle East and, vice versa. But to mention someone who was, in Spain and I never would have guessed Sicily.
Absolutely. I mean, look at the history of Sicily. It's so interesting. You think, oh, Sicily, it's Italian, right? You think of,
right.
Immigrants coming in from Italy and the influence of Italian Americans. I mean, even until today on everything from the urban planning I know you're in Toronto, but I don't know if you've been to New York, but, you look at Canal Street and north of Canal Street all the way up to Houston. Look at Mott Street in Little Italy. And then you also look at Bay Ridge in Brooklyn and, Bensonhurst and Dyker Heights. And of course, we have all the Italian movies with Al Pacino and Robert De Niro in the United States. You think of a flag that's red, white, and green, right? But then you start to think, well, wait a minute, what's their history? And how come we all kind of look alike? Because I've seen Sicilians that look just like me. And I look just like them. So I'm like, how is this connected? And then that's when you start. You're never going to understand any of this, anyone watching, unless you actually start to understand the principle and the basis of what's going on. And if you don't try to understand that, then your effort is wasted. You see, I've figured out that a lot of people are proud of where they're from, but they don't know why. And I want to be able to definitively say, this, and this is what makes my identity up. And I say that as someone who has struggled with identity. So as much as any other immigrant to the United States or West has as well, right? All of us have, watched My Big Fat Greek Wedding. And I remember very innocently, completely relating to that. There was a scene where she's sitting in the lunchroom and she pulls out her musa'a, as we call it in Arabic, which is moussaka. And the cute little blonde girls start saying, "What are you eating, moussaka?" Like, it's such an innocent line in the movie, but it's like, well, wait a minute. I remember when my mom used to make hot dogs, like sujuk, and my mom would wrap it in aluminum foil and I'd have to take it to school with me in Minnesota. It was embarrassing, but it was the same concept. So, if you're first generation immigrant, you don't want to say, I'm proud to be Egyptian. And yeah, we built the pyramids, and I'm proud to be Muslim. And yeah, this is what Islam is about. And I don't want to have to keep repeating it. I want to give you the knowledge so that you have enough of an interest to go and research it on your own. Because at the very end of the day, we're going to have to live in the community together, right?
Very true. I'm glad that you mentioned New York, because I've been there multiple times. And it's interesting that you mentioned, you looking like some of the maybe Italian immigrants that live there as well, and vice versa.
I get it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's not something a lot of people think about, and people don't realize how much Muslims have contributed to history regardless of where they're from. And it's something, that's why we have Muslim History Month.
Right.
That's what it's all about, learning more.
Right. I respect the communities in the West that accept, so first of all, I greatly respect, more than anything in the United States. I'm a very proud American. I'm also very proud Egyptian. But more than anything, I love that there is a process for a regulation or a rule to be made. And it doesn't matter if it's at the federal level or the state level or the municipal level. It doesn't matter. I love going to urban planning commission meetings. So what are those? Those are basically meetings that are held in the community. You can look them up on your local websites, whether they're city or municipal, township or borough or state or whatnot. And they basically go through, there's a commission of urban planners that are either selected or elected or appointed somehow by the government. By the mayor's office, by the government, or they're elected. There's some process, basically, depending on what city and what country you're in, that they're placed there. And the Urban Planning Commission looks at plans that developers submit to the city to see if that's viable for the community, and whether it's good to increase job growth, or it's good to increase affordable housing, or whatnot. And my favorite part of this process is in cities that are largely Muslim. So we can use examples from my own background. So Minneapolis has a very large Somalian American population, which is entirely Muslim. And in the same breath, so is Dearborn, Michigan, which is, heavily Muslim as well. It doesn't matter if you're Shia or Sunni or whatnot, or what category you fall under, denomination, but it's heavily Muslim. And I think it's incredible when you see these urban planning commissions, which 90% of the time they don't have a single Muslim on them, and a developer or a community member submits an application for something called a conditional permit, a conditional use, which is where the developer is going to either build something or program something. And they're asking the city if this is allowable because it's zoned A, B, and C, and we need permission from the city in order to be able to have this structure function this way, or this program run the way it is. What I find incredible is when you have no Muslims on urban planning commissions, and in majority Muslim cities in America, applications are submitted for the call to prayer. And the review is I don't want to use the word scientific, but it's thorough, right? Like, is this good for the community? Is this going to happen? Is it a positive thing? Is it a negative thing? And my experience as a trained urban planner is that 9 times out of 10, there is always an approval for the call to prayer. And I find that an incredible example of how we are able to assimilate, and how we're able to look at these policymakers and say, This is our culture. This is our religion. We will put this structure here, and we'd like to know if we can have a call to prayer. And having a non-Muslim majority, and most of the time, these people have political affiliations. Most of the time, it getting approved. So if we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion and having a fabric or a tapestry of multiple elements of the United States or the West, I'm sure it's similar in Canada, we can absolutely find a way to stand our ground, be proud of our background and our heritage, and still be able to weave through policies and regulations and abide by the place that we live in, right? I do believe that America has, for better or worse, the most process-oriented justice system in the world. And it might be lengthy. It might take you years to get through it. But it's definitely procedural. Like, oftentimes things are not, a beat is not skipped. And the urban planning commissions and town hall meetings are absolutely where you can see that the best, where applications are submitted and community members are allowed to speak.
That's definitely something I didn't know. That's really good information for sure. Because you hear people requesting, for example, to call to prayer, and they're like, "Oh, they were just denied immediately." But you don't think about the that there's a process, and sometimes they're not, and things happen.
And right, and sometimes why are they denied? Right, like it does not help us as a community to say it was automatically denied because we are Muslim.
Right.
That is usually not the truth. No one's, yes, you're going to have people that are xenophobic and racist and whatnot. But when it comes to an application process, it's just you fill the application process out and you sit down with the commission and figure it out. I think I just read that there's somewhere in Michigan that there was like a 90% Polish town, or a 90% Polish descendants, I believe, lived in this town. 90% Polish descendants lived in this town. And they actually approved a call to prayer request on a conditional use permit. That's incredible. That's amazing, right? So you've got a lot of converts in this town that are Polish descendants. And at the same time, and I mean, forgive me if I'm getting the details of this urban planning approval wrong, but in gist, we're not talking about it must be approved. No, we're talking about looking at the community and understanding what's best for the community so that we can become a part of the tapestry of that community without having to say it got denied because they're xenophobic. It got denied because of this. It got denied because of that. And there are instances of xenophobia and racism, of course, but if we take that negative part away and we enter the situation in a positive way, there's no way that we can be assumed elsewise. And then that reflects on our identity as well. And I do believe most of us have some form of an identity confusion, right? Like when I say us, I mean immigrants that are first generation immigrants. I'm not talking about just Muslim. I'm talking about whether you're from Egypt or Greece or Slovakia or China or India or Brazil, wherever you're from, right? There's going to be something in your culture that does not match the mesh of the United States and Canada, right? And the West in general. So having to find our way and navigate our way through this is super important. Look at your historical figures. What did they do? How did they persevere? Because their inventions are still standing strong today. So if they could do it, they made a point. They made some type of a, social sacrifice for the community at large. We can do the same thing.
That's very true. That is very true. I wanted to say something. I've lost my train of thought. It was so good. I feel like
I'm throwing too much information at you. I'm throwing historical figures and my opinion and time and identity.
I do think I was going to say something along the lines of, we have to learn from history. It's so important, and I think a lot of people think, you've got to look back at history, and so you learn from people's mistakes and all of this, but you also have to learn about all these great things and these great ideas they had, and where you come from, and and for me, like I'm born and raised in the US, small state of Arkansas, and I'm a convert. So, I have to navigate sometimes, like religion with the Western culture. And, there are people who say,
You got reverse assimilation.
exactly. And so it's really cool to see the history of Muslims. And I'm like, I feel like, I'm part of this, even though the culture is like completely different. I'm like, this is like now part of my history. And so I think it's really important to learn. And I think it helps, converts and other Muslims today, you know connect with their religion, not just, maybe where they're from, but just the religion itself is very interesting.
Right, because you probably get a lot of pushback and questions from your own, wherever you went to high school in Arkansas. Are you from Little Rock?
So I lived in Little Rock, but I'm actually from an even smaller town. But I lived in Little Rock for about 3 years. So when I think of it, I think of Little Rock. I think, oh, Little Rock is home. But
Right.
I
Right.
didn't grow up in. I grew up in an even smaller town and ended up in Little Rock.
Little Rock. So that's the same concept, right? Because you also would have something to add to the Muslim community. I mean, if there's not, and this is exactly why you can't just name just one person, because you'll get somebody like you, right? You've converted to Islam, and you're still, at the very end of the day, you were raised as a non-immigrant child. And so, and that's where a lot of people get confused too, right? So they'll, culture and religion are not the same thing, but one impacts the other, whether you like it or not, right? It's the same thing for you. And I see that concept of navigating identity. Everybody thinks, oh, it's just the immigrants in this country that have to navigate identity. And then you got the double standard of being Muslim and an immigrant from somewhere else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're from a country. I remember I said this. It's harder for people coming from other countries that were not colonized by England to navigate the United States than other countries. So earlier I said that Italy had conquered Libya. And so then you've got some Italian culture, some Libyan, obviously you're Libyan American, Muslim American. Then you're immigrating to the United States on top of that. Whereas if you're coming from England, if you're coming from a colonized country from England, whether you're Indian or Egyptian or, whatever other country, right? At least you kind of, unfortunately, and this is not a positive imperial argument by all means. It is absolutely not. But at a minimum, you kind of have this knowledge of how the Western European countries ran, right? From their unfortunate colonialism in your own country. And then you're coming to the United States and you're saying, oh, okay, well, we drank tea and crumpets growing up because they colonized us. And that was a popular thing to do. And now I live in Birmingham, England, and they have, tea and crumpets. So at least there's some type of identification element, right? But then when you're coming from a country that wasn't colonized like that, like, Libya is my only example, but, whatever other country, it's a completely other layer of complication for your identity, right? Probably makes it more difficult for you to be able to step out and say, it either makes it more difficult for you to step out and say, I would like to try to innovate this or create this invention, or it makes it easier because you're such an outlier, right? In your instance, you're doing the opposite. And I think that's kind of cool. So how could there just be one person that adds to the pot? It's not possible. It's not possible.
Exactly. I love it. It takes everybody.
It really does.
And from everywhere, which I love. I love it. And that's one of the reasons I love living, for example, in Canada. There's so much diversity here.
I like that you're from Canada. I am a huge sports fanatic. For anybody watching that knows me, knows how involved I am in the ice hockey community in the tri-state area.
Okay.
I'm a huge supporter of children's sports. I'm heavily involved. My son plays hockey. My daughter plays lacrosse. She's also a dancer, a performance dancer, not competitive. And I love sports. And it's probably because of how I grew up in the suburbs. I've got really awesome Minnesota Golden Gopher license plates I will never give up. I hope no insurance company's watching me right now, but um, so yeah, I am heavily involved. It was kind of my way of like, I think growing up thinking, okay, well, I'm still Americanized. Like, I didn't choose to be born here. My parents gave birth to me. I didn't make that decision. But now that you're allowing me to stay and grow up here, well, I'm gonna follow the system. And I think for me, probably sports and traveling was probably my biggest way of understanding myself. And I'm also, forget being Muslim. I'm a female. And my friends and I, we're, volunteer chief administrators for a program that is 95% boys run. And we're all women that run it, and none of us know how to skate. So it kind of shows you on the same lines of finesse that if you really are passionate about something and you really care about something in the community, it didn't, in the sports world, it didn't matter that we were Muslim or that, in my instance, I'm, obviously Arab, North African, female, Muslim, Mediterranean. I mean, box, check. And, the two other women, one of them is Chinese American, and it doesn't faze us. It has no impact on us whatsoever. As long as you can find your spot in a community, whether it's in the arts, whether it's with sports, whether it's whatever is going on, you absolutely can push through and persevere in what people don't expect you to succeed in, hands down, if you have that drive and that passion to do it. So, if anybody on the East Coast likes ice hockey, send me a message, and I'll gladly talk to you about it. Last year, actually, was kind of cool. In October, we did the first international ice hockey tournament in Egypt. And it was just such a cool experience to be able to couple, two things together that I'm passionate about, right? Like my background and sports that I love, and be able to bring that to the forefront. So, yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Hard to imagine ice hockey in Egypt.
It actually is fantastic. It's pretty cool. It was just a group of us, and it was just, listen, if you're passionate about something, you'll make it happen.
Exactly. And I always like to bring up, women figures as well. And, I was thinking while we were talking, you and I and everyone else who has gone to a university wouldn't have been able to do that if it wasn't for a female Muslim.
Absolutely.
Who started the first university. And Absolutely. A lot of people do not know that.
Nope. And most people don't. Was it in Morocco?
Yes.
Yep. My history's spot on. I'd love to pull like the Egyptian card and be like, well, Al-Azhar University was the first organized university in the world, but it's not true. It's actually Morocco. So, people don't realize that. Well, one of the greatest female hockey players that advocates for ice hockey is actually an Arab female. Okay. And her name is, I believe, and I could, again, someone can correct me later on. I think her name is Fatma Ali. She is from the Emirates. Fantastic hockey player. Attends has some type of connection to the Washington Capitals. And it's just so cool to see that on ice. So there's a lot of female Arabs, a lot of female Muslims that actually play. That's really neat.
Yeah, that's so cool.
And also the collegiate level, there's, at the Division I NCAA level, there's a lot of Muslim females that play as well. And I'm not talking field hockey.
Yeah.
I'm talking ice hockey.
Ice skates and all.
Ice skates and all.
Well, it's been a great talk, and I've definitely learned something, and I hope the audience has too. Is there anything that you want to add before we wrap up?
Just don't stop. Just keep going. Whoever you are, whatever you are, use your identity as a tool, not as a hindrance. Be very, very proud of where you're from, and be strategic on how you show your pride. Because there's a very famous quote. I don't know it exactly off the top of my head. It's one of my favorite quotes. It's by Virginia Woolf. So Virginia Woolf was a famous author in the 1900s, and she said something to the effect of, it doesn't make sense for us to squirt the rose bush without pointing all our efforts at actually where the water should be pointed to. So don't just say I'm Muslim, I'm female, and therefore follow me. No. Put the work in, create the product, create the service. People will see the cream always rises to the top. It's no different than sports. You could put $1 million into a player, but if the kid doesn't want to play, he's not going to play. So it's the same idea. If you are doing whatever you're doing in the community, do it with heart. Do it with gidaya. Do it with a good niyyah. Do it in a way that lets people see that you're more service-oriented than you are trying to resolve your identity issues. That's my advice. People will see, people will know, and people will understand. Humanity is not as evil as I think we all think it is. And assimilation is important, I would say. Use your historical figures to try to understand where you came from so that you have a point of argumentation. Know your history and read. Read everything about Islamic history. If you're going to be a change maker, you have to be able to say, I know A, B, and C, and this is why this applies. And this is why I'm confident what I'm saying is true.
That's very good advice. I think that was like the perfect way to wrap things up. Tell people to keep going. I like it. I really appreciate you joining me. Thank you so much for teaching us something new.
No problem. And I don't know if this helps at all, but I do mentor at various levels. If anybody is ever interested in learning about former philosophers or how to survive education. Don't get as many degrees as I did. Just enter the workforce. I'm more than available to answer questions. I've been through it all.
Very accomplished, mashallah. All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Or morning, I guess.
Yeah, wherever you are in the world.
Wherever you are in the world.
Thank you to everyone who watched this live. Thank you so much. Tune in next week to talk about change makers in discovery. That'll be at 9 a.m. Eastern time, same place. And thank you so much again for joining us. You can also follow along with everything Muslim History Month by searching the hashtag and joining the conversation using the hashtag Here Our History and hashtag Muslim History Month. And we'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum.